Well, we are going to explore one of the more troublesome, one of the more complicated and controversial passages in the New Testament. Pretty much the Gospels are narratives, but they include some discourses, and there's none that's caused more confusion than the so-called Olivet Discourse, the name given to this very, very unusual presentation by Jesus to his disciples. This presentation is recorded in 3 of the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and suffers greatly by a number of presumptions that people bring to it. One of the things that we try to do when we study the Gospels is we tend to harmonize them. We try to crunch them together to try to understand the life of Christ, because each of the Gospels records some things that the others don't. And when we get to the Olivet Discourse, there has been a tradition, a tendency, an understandable tendency to assume that these 3 presentations recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are on the same subject given at the same time. And yet, as we examine more closely, it raises all kinds of questions. And so we're going to attempt to take a look at this. And probably the best way to start is let's just read the accounts that are in each of these places. In Matthew 24, it opens up. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Rather remarkable prophecy in the first place, because 38 years later, that's exactly what happened. The temple was literally taken apart, stone by the Roman soldiers. So he predicted this 38 years in advance. As he sat upon the Mount of Olives, his disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the age, or the end of the world? Good questions. Jesus answered and said to them, Take heed that no man deceive you. It's interesting that in each of the accounts, it opens and closes with the Lord's admonition that we be not deceived. And one of the questions that should be in the back of our mind, great, how do we execute that command? How do we make sure that we're not deceived? That's the challenge before us every day, let alone in this briefing. Jesus continued, said, For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. And all these are the beginning of sorrows, or more technically, the beginning of birth pangs in the Greek, but recorded in our King James traditional presentation, the beginning of sorrows. There's a group of signs here, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There should be famines, pestilences, earthquakes in divers places. This group of signs will be common to each of the accounts. We'll be making reference to this, what Matthew calls the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. And ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. So here again we have this theme of deception all the way through here. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. That little parenthetical comment is also recorded in both Matthew and Mark. And we'll come back to this very key pivotal verse as we analyze this more carefully later. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not, for there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they should deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn the parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall two be in the field, one shall be taken, the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, one shall be taken, and the other left. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant, whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Verily I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant shall say in his heart, My Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken, the Lord of the servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder, and point him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's a quick pass through Matthew's account of this presentation. Mark's is virtually identical with a couple of things that we'll highlight later. The real difference comes with Luke. So let's take a look at how Luke records what apparently is the same presentation. He starts about verse 5 of chapter 21. He says, As some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, As for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Certainly sounds like the previous one, doesn't it? And they ask him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? And he said, Take heed that ye be not deceived. See, there again the emphasis. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. But when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. Then said he unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines, and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. But before all these they shall lay their hands on you, and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, and it shall turn to you for a testimony. Set it therefore in your hearts not to meditate before what ye shall answer. For I will give you a mouth and a wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to gainsay nor resist. and ye shall be betrayed, both by parents and brethren and kinsfolk and friends. And some of you shall they cause to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But there shall not a hair of your head perish. In your patience possess ye your souls. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And there shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations and perplexity, and the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming in the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these signs begin to come to pass, then look up, and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. And he spake to them a parable. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. Where they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch ye therefore, and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. So that's Luke's presentation. You know, it's clear why most people would jump to the conclusion that these are identical, and yet they're not identical. On the one hand, they're too similar to dismiss as being distinct or separate. And yet, as we get into the details, more of the details seem to contradict each other, seem to cause more confusion. There are some good scholars that have so focused on Luke's presentation that they argue that all of this is past, that it all happened back in 70 AD. And they argue that these broader statements are just allegories or metaphors. And so that leads to a view that's called preterism. Preterists believe that there isn't prophecy, it's all been done in the past, that the rest is all allegorical. And it's a very prevalent and growing point of view today, largely because, not entirely, but largely because of the differences in Luke's account than Matthew's in this passage. So we're facing some issues here. The destruction of Jerusalem, what is it talking about? Is it talking about that famous destruction back in AD 70? Or is it talking about something yet future? There are people that hold both views. And that's one of the first issues. And then there's this strange event that both Matthew and Mark not only talk about, but highlight. This strange incident called the abomination of desolation. And what is it? And when did it happen? Or has it happened yet? Clearly it did happen in 167 BC. Every Jew would know that. And that allusion certainly takes that into view. And yet, Jesus is talking about it yet future. Did it happen in 70 AD? Or is it yet in the future? And that's one of the issues that emerges from these passages. And of course, the whole issue of the Great Tribulation is highlighted here, of course, by Matthew and Mark. The parable of the fig tree raises all kinds of questions. What is the fig tree? Is it an idiom of Israel? And all kinds of people set dates because of a generation from the time that the state of Israel came. Or when, maybe it's the Jerusalem, when the state of Jerusalem fell under the Star of David. All kinds of books have been published on that deal with the parable of the fig tree and this generation that will not pass away. Which generation is it? Is it the generation that Jesus is talking to there? Or is it a generation that's going to see some of these signs? Which signs? Are the signs crisp enough to start a stopwatch? No, not really. And so that raises all kinds of questions. And lurking behind all of this is a very controversial doctrine to some called the doctrine of imminence. we feel that many places throughout the New Testament, Jesus clearly taught us to expect him at any moment. That's a doctrine that you find embedded in many, many passages, and of course it emerges in this one. And can Jesus come back for his own at any time, or are there events that must transpire before he can come back? There's scholars with different views of that. In any case, the idea of imminence is impacting each one of us individually. Can Jesus come back before this briefing's over, or tomorrow morning, or next week, or 10 years from now, or whenever? And that's an issue. So before we get into this even in any more depth, we need to understand what some of the issues are before us. And one of these issues I would classify as an issue in epistemology. Now, what do you mean by that fancy word? Epistemology is the study of knowledge, its scope and limits. It begs the question, how do we know anything? And this is really an epistemological issue because Jesus gave us a command. He said, be not deceived. That's more than just hermeneutics or theories of interpretation. That's a fundamental issue. How do you know anything, and how do you be sure of that which you know is true? And that's a non-trivial issue. What tools do we have to make sure that we're not deceived? And the first thing, our approach will be, first of all, to establish the integrity of the Word of God. Because most of the truth that we're clinging to is truth that's been revealed to us, not the kind of truth that you might find in an empirical test in a laboratory. There's different kinds of information. But in this case, the first thing we try to do is establish the integrity of the Word of God. And that's something we won't do in a quick briefing. It's something you need to discover for yourself. But approach these 66 books that we call the Bible. Recognize they're penned by more than 40 guys over several thousand years, and then discover that the collection is very skillfully designed, even down to the subtleties underneath the text. The evidence of design is something you need to discover from cover to cover, from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. But then the second thing that emerges from that discovery is the realization that it had to have its origin from outside our space-time. It actually is provably of extraterrestrial origin. We're not going to try to tackle that whole subject in this briefing. I just want to highlight it up front because that's the premises. Those are the two premises that undergird our entire ministry. That we have the 66 books penned by more than 40 guys over several thousand years that have integrity of design, and that design had to have its origin from outside the dimensionality of time. So once you establish that for yourself, and you really need to discover that for yourself through your study, then that leads to the next discovery, and that's just discover who Jesus Christ is, what his claims were they valid, etc. And from the Word of God, you can establish the reality, the uniqueness, and the majesty of a person, the person of Jesus Christ. And once you've gone that far, your next step then is to study carefully consider precisely what he said. In other words, what he said with precision. One of the other things, this leads us now, if we've established that foundation, the next step then gets into what's called hermeneutics, the theory of interpretation. We have these books, how do we interpret them? One of the things we need to be sensitive to, the Scripture does use what would be called rhetorical devices or figures of speech. Allegories, acrostics, metaphors, similes, puns, types. There's actually a list of over 200 different types of figures of speech. We need to understand when something is just a figure of speech or a proverbial phrase and when it is to be taken very literally. And so we're going to find all kinds of places. Is the passage we're going to explore, is it allegorical or is it intended to be taken literally? Was there literally an abomination of desolation on the Temple Mount? Are these signs that he's talking about, earthquakes, pestilences, and so forth, are they literal or are they just figures of speech? That's an issue that we'll deal with. But more fundamentally then, one of the other things we're going to watch for here is these parallel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are they different renderings of the same event? Or is it possible that there were separate occasions that happen to be very similar? That's one of the issues that will lurk behind our grappling with some of the apparent contradictions that we're going to encounter here. And is the language precise or approximate? I personally have the view that God doesn't use the word approximate in his word very, very frequently. I think God means what he says and says what he means. So one of the things we're going to presume as we attack this issue is a high view of the text, a high view of inspiration, that we believe that the Holy Spirit not only inspired the writers but superintended what was said, often including meanings that went far beyond the understanding of the penman. And that's our view. And we feel called to that view by Jesus himself. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, Jesus says, "Think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I come not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, until not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law till all be fulfilled." Now, a jot or a tittle is a Hebraic expression equivalent to our dotting an I or crossing a T. A jot is the smallest of the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. You and I would mistake it as an apostrophe or a blemish on the paper. A tittle is the little hook that distinguishes certain letters. Very subtle. And so the jot and tittle is a Hebrew equivalent to our saying, not the crossing of the T or the dotting of an I will pass from the law till all be fulfilled. I believe that is an instruction to us to take the text very seriously. Obviously, in the original, we're dealing, of course, with a translation. But the other issue that should stay in front of us to try to avoid being deceived, and that is the whole counsel of God. You know, there is nothing that will test our hermeneutics more rigorously than the field of eschatology. Of all the different fields of study that relate to theology and the Bible and so forth, eschatology is the study of last things. And eschatology is that field of study that will most tax us to be exactly precise in our definitions and to be very, very alert to exactly what the text is saying. Again and again and again through history, we find people taking strange views, especially views that prove to be even stranger, because they jump to conclusions or they impose on the text something that it isn't said. So this is one of the places that you'll be most challenged in your hermeneutics is when you study eschatology. That's one reason so many pastors are very reluctant to get into eschatological issues from the pulpit, because it does test them in terms of their hermeneutics. And the whole counsel of God. See, a true study of prophecy is to have the whole plan of God in view, not just the future part of it. It should all tie together. And you really should reserve judgment on any issue until you have all the relevant texts in front of you. When you tackle an issue, a serious issue, one of the things you really need to do, in effect, is put all the relevant texts in front of you and fit them together. Because very often, where two seem to contradict, in that apparent contradiction is a discovery. And so, again, diligence is what is rewarded. We're dealing with a very integrated and very deliberate design of the text, every word. So we start with the presumption that the Matthew account and the Luke account will dovetail in some appropriate way. And where it appears to contradict itself, there may be some illumination for us. So eschatology, let's understand something else. As you get into the field of eschatology, which is what we're dealing with, of course, your first fork in the road is, are you premillennial or amillennial? The Bible talks about Jesus coming back to the earth and ruling from the throne of David. Gabriel promised that to Mary, and the entire Old Testament is full of over 1,000 remarks, about 1,800 actually, of Jesus ruling on the earth through the nation Israel. And so people who take that seriously would be called premillennials. They believe there literally will be a millennium. However, it's very fashionable, became very fashionable in the early centuries, to assume that those were just allegories, that Jesus rules in our heart. There's a whole field of eschatological viewpoint that denies the idea that there will really be a literal millennium. That would be called amillennial. And that first emerged really, a guy by the name of Origen had a style of interpretation that was very, very soft, very, very allegorical. And that greatly influenced Augustine. And so Augustine, as he dealt with some of the theological issues of his day, adopted an amillennial point of view. And you need to understand how this came about, because in those days, as the church became a state church. And as the pastors were on the payroll of the government, they had an awkward position. It was hard from that pulpit to say that Jesus is coming back to rid the world of its evil rulers. It didn't really fly too much with their evil rulers. And so they softened that by saying, well, that's just allegorical. And so it was politically correct to demean or minimize that point of view. And so that became the view of the medieval church. And even when we get to the Reformation, 15th century and following, that the reformers did an enormous job repairing our misconceptions into soteriology, the study of salvation. It's by faith alone. And that became the watchword for the whole Reformation. And many people were burned at the stake in their commitment to that soteriology, that understanding of salvation. But what they didn't do is go far enough in some other areas, and they totally ignored the eschatology. So most Protestant denominations, as they broke away from the medieval church, didn't repair their eschatology. And today, many major denominations are really amillennial. They really don't take the idea of Jesus' literal return to the earth very seriously. And so that's one of the first divisions. There was a group many years ago that were postmillennial. They argued that we're in the millennium already. And so that was especially in the late 19th century was popular, but as the 20th century started to roll over, I think most people began to realize things aren't better than they've ever been, and they began to realize that if we're in the millennium, then among other things, Satan's chain is too long. It's the postmillennial view is really is not operative today particularly. But out of amillennialism, there comes a variation of that called preterism, which argues that all prophecy's been fulfilled, it's behind us, it served its purpose back in the early centuries, but it's all, at this point, at best allegorical. And preterism is on the rise to this day. It's one of the reasons we want to attack some of the issues here in this passage. Now, those of us that are premillennial also divide into about three groups. And that has to do when we read in both Daniel emphasized and in Matthew's account the idea of the Great Tribulation. One of the issues that emerges, does the church survive that? Does it go through that? Or is it removed before that? And people who believe that the church is removed before the tribulation can even start are called pre-tribulationists. There are others that feel that the church will go through the tribulation and won't be removed until the end of that tribulation period. They're called post-tribulationists. In between those two groups, there are some that argue that, for some technical reasons, that yes, the church will go through up to the abomination of desolation. It'll be removed just before then. They make the point very accurately that the tribulation technically is not 7 years, the last 3.5 years. But again, that's a minority position in a sense. But the main point is most denominations on these issues will turn out to be amillennial and post-tribulational. They don't believe in a literal millennium, and they also believe that the church is destined to go through this tribulation period. And that's the most denominations. On the other hand, those of us that accept a millennial position and believe that the church will be removed before the tribulation would be called pre-tribulationists. Most fundamentalists, most people who take the Bible very, very literally tend to fall on that side. And here's the point I really want to make, is your eschatological view will derive from your hermeneutics. If you're among those that take the Bible very literally, you will swing to the right hand of this chart. You'll tend to be premillennial, and among those, pre-tribulational. If, on the other hand, you're willing to take much of the Bible just an allegory, as just a moral point to be made and not literally, that's what we call a soft hermeneutic, you'll be on the left side of this chart. You'll be typically amillennial or post-tribulational. But your hermeneutics, your approach to interpretation will determine your eschatology. Now, there's another hazard as we worry about getting deceived and how to, this whole field of epistemology, if you may. There are hazards that we bring to any study by our traditions or our presuppositions or presumptions. And we just completed some studies that you may have availed yourself of some of the traditions in Judaism and what I call the tangled tethers. The Judaism that we read in the Old Testament, for lack of a better term, we'll call Mosaic Judaism, that following the laws of Moses. But obviously, what started to happen in the centuries just before Christ is the Pharisees started to add rules. They infused in their understanding what they called oral traditions, the laws that were not written down, passed verbally. And they started to incorporate that. And that's one of the things that Jesus attacked during the gospel period. Again and again and again, he chided the Pharisees because they are victims of their traditions rather than the intent of the law. And so we have Pharisaical Judaism extant during the New Testament period. And after Israel rejects her Messiah, and especially after the temple gets destroyed in 70 AD, they have a real problem because they're taught in the Torah that without the shedding of blood there is no remission of sins. And now they have no way to have offerings because there's no altar, there's no temple. So they end up redefining Judaism, starting with the Council of Yavne or however you want to pronounce it. They started redefining that, and that ends up the oral laws start getting written down in what they call the Talmud. And so today you have extant what would be called Talmudic Judaism. That's one step even beyond the Pharisaical Judaism in that it incorporates the opinions of rabbis as being operative, in fact, even more operative than the text itself. And so we end up the Gaonic era where they venerate some of the great rabbis over and above, really, the text itself. And so that trend continues into the 12th century, where we have the Kabbalah and all of that. Kabbalah, at this point, their viewpoints on most topics are not only deviant from the Torah and the text, they're opposed to them. And the strange irony, of course, out of that comes Hasidic Judaism, the Orthodox that you're familiar with in New York and in parts of Jerusalem. The main point is the drift is away from the original text. If you look at the original text as the stake in the ground and their willingness to incorporate viewpoints as a leash, the leash is too long. They drift more and more away from the text so that as you get into the Kabbalah and so forth, you're actually dealing with issues that are, the conclusions of which are 180 degrees opposite from what the Torah teaches, strangely enough. So we run the same risks in our studies. And one of the ways we run into a similar risk is we start harmonizing the Gospels. That's very useful if you're trying to simply study the New Testament. If you're trying to summarize it all, is to try to take the four gospel accounts and sort out where did he go when and what happened next to try to create a timeline. And that's an exercise worth doing on the one hand, but you do run into some strange things trying to do that because you'll discover there's one place the account speaks of one demon, another one two demons, and it seems like it's for a lot of reasons the same event. Now, that's not too big a problem. The fact that there are two, there certainly was one, and the one that's the key part of the story is emphasized. But there are a number of places where there are subtle differences that trouble some scholars. But no place is it more troublesome, these apparent distinctives, than in the Olivet Discourse. And so one of the things we want to be careful, as we combine these different accounts, we also run the risk of losing resolution, losing a sharpness of focus. And so the Olivet Discourse issue, of course, is part of it. Which parts are past and which are yet future. And is it just one briefing, or is it really just the summary of several briefings? That's also a possibility. Because all of these, as we read Genesis, as we read the Gospels, they're all summaries. Not every detail is written down. They intrinsically are editorialized by the writer to some degree. But I want to talk, before we jump into the text themselves and looking at it closely, I want to anticipate some things that are coming by talking about a term from the field of optics called resolving power. If you buy a telescope, a cheap telescope, say, and look at a star, you may see some representation of that star. But if you then spend a lot more money and get a really good telescope, you discover that that same star is actually two stars. And that's called the resolving power of the optics. It's an actual, has a mathematical definition, and one of the characteristics of a telescope system is its resolving power, its ability to distinguish, among what they call binary stars and so forth. So I think we have here in the Olivet Discourse an issue of resolving power, because I'm going to assume that for this purpose, Matthew and Mark are virtually identical. I'll show you the differences. There's some insights that come from the differences, but they're not that controversial. The real problem is between Matthew and Luke. Both of the accounts have in common a group of signs that Matthew labels the beginning of sorrows, the wars, pestilences, earthquakes, and so forth. That cluster of signs is a cluster of signs in both accounts. In both Matthew's account and Luke. They seem to mention the same signs, and I think we can jump to the conclusion that they have the same thing in view, even though the accounts themselves have some differences. Luke will emphasize most of what he says as occurring before those signs. And Matthew is going to emphasize the things, most of what he talks about comes after those signs. So if we're alert to that as we read, and we're reading these, if we put them side by side, we become very conscious of the fact that Luke and Matthew are talking about different things that are very similar, but they're different. In Luke's case, they occur before these big signs. And I'm going to call, he speaks of a desolation of Jerusalem, and I'm just going to call desolation number 1. Matthew talks about a desolation of Jerusalem that comes after those signs. It's a different event altogether. Desolation number 2. And let's just use that as a hypothesis going in here. Let's now take a look more carefully at the Matthew account, and we'll drag Mark along with us as we go. As we call it, just to refresh your memory, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. He was in the temple. He has departed. We can presume shortly that they're on the way across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. Jesus said unto them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that it shall not be thrown down. And as we're all acquainted, 38 years later, that's literally what happened. And as he sat about the Mount of Olives, notice where this presentation is being given. It's on the Mount of Olives. Surprisingly enough, that's not true of the Luke account. So it's not necessarily the same event. As he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. This is an inside deal. This is not for the general public. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? The disciples, these are disciples now. This is the inner, in fact, it's not just the disciples, it's a very inside group. If you look at the Mark account, his is very similar. He went out of the temple, and one of his disciples said to him, Master, see what manner of stones and buildings there are, Lord, admiring this incredible temple. Jesus answering said to him, seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Recognize Mark's gospel, by the way, is Peter's words. Mark apparently was his, most scholars recognize that it's really Peter's rendering. In any case, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives over and against the temple, Peter, James, and John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of when all these things shall be fulfilled. So this account parallels Matthew very precisely. In fact, gives us a detail Matthew didn't bother to include. He actually gives us a list of the people that are getting this private briefing. Peter, James, and John are very familiar to us because they're always the insiders. And this case, Peter's brother Andrew is with them. So they have 4 of them. Now, if you take a look at Jesus' followers as a total cluster, outside that we'll call the general public. Now, after Matthew chapter 12, he never speaks to the public except in parables. And there's some reasons for that that are explained in Matthew 13. But his followers, obviously, he speaks to. Within that, he's got a group of 70, and within that, he's got the 12 that we're very familiar with, the famous 12. And among the 12, we've got this inner circle, which is, with one exception, is basically Peter, James, and John. When Jairus' daughter is raised, those 3 were the only ones allowed in. At the Transfiguration, those 3 are the only ones that are allowed up there. And at Gethsemane, They were all there to pray after the upper room, but the three he went further and let them come a little closer. In other words, you can't miss the fact that somehow these three are insiders. And at the Olivet Discourse, they're there, but in this case, Andrew's with them. So we got 4 people, not all of them, at this briefing. He continues. Jesus answered and said, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." No problem so far. Then he mentions these signs, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, that see that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." Now this group of signs gets a lot of attention from scholars. These nation against nation, famines, pestilence, earthquakes, in divers places. In fact, we'll notice that they're listed in all the accounts, not only in Matthew and Luke at their respective verses, but also when we get to the book of Revelation, in chapter 6, when the Lamb takes the 7-sealed book and starts opening the seals, there's a sequence that is the same sequence. The white horseman, representing a false Christ, the wars, the red horseman, and then the famines and pestilences and so forth. And so the parallelism is well recognized by most scholars. Matthew continues, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and hate one another, and many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many." I want you to notice that very key word at the beginning of verse 9. It's Matthew 24, verse 9, and Luke 21, verse 12, that are in antithesis, or opposites. Here, everything Matthew's talking about happens after that group of signs. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted. Then shall many be affected, and so forth. Key point in our review here. "And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold." You know, many people miss Matthew 24:12 as a prophetic sign. But it's interesting as we look at our culture, and even in the body of Christ, the love of many shall wax cold. That word love in the Greek is agape. And my wife has made quite a point of that's an interesting, very demonstrable, very measurable sign in our culture, how the love of many waxes cold. The fact that the divorce rates within the body of Christ are no better, probably worse than the divorce rates in the secular world. Something is wrong. "Because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come." And then we get to verse 15, which is incidentally identical to the equivalent verse in Mark 13, and it's Mark 13:14 and Matthew 24:15. Both of them highlight this very pivotal, key fulcrum of the whole passage. "When ye therefore shall see," so this is yet future. Whatever he's talking about, when Jesus is talking to his disciples privately, it's yet a future event. What makes it puzzling, he refers to a historical event to make his point. "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation," spoken of by Daniel the prophet. What on earth is the abomination of desolation? We're going to want to understand that. It's a term that any Jew in those days would know all about, because it leads to an event that is celebrated to this day in Hanukkah. The whole issue of Hanukkah is the rededication of a temple from that desecration. So we want to understand, and we can understand what it was because it's a well-documented historical fact. The abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. You know, I love this passage here, because this remark by our Lord Jesus Christ has saved you and me a great deal of boring library research. The book of Daniel is one of the best documented books of the Old Testament as being authoritative and so forth. But we don't even have to bother, because we know who wrote the book of Daniel. Who wrote the book of Daniel? Daniel did. How do I know? Jesus said so. If you know who Jesus Christ is, then you have no problem with the book of Daniel. And if you don't know who Jesus Christ is, you got bigger problems than the authorship of Daniel. But spoken of by Daniel, he also authenticates his office as a prophet. And Daniel speaks of the abomination of desolation 4 times. Chapter 8, chapter 9, 11, and 12. And so it's a recurring event that's emphasized in the study of Daniel. As you study Daniel, you'll want to know all about what the abomination of desolation is. We'll talk about it here in a minute. But I want you to notice whatever it is, well, let's just break it down. The word abomination in the scripture is used of idols. To worship an idol is an abomination before the Lord. That term is used all through the Old and New Testaments. The abomination of desolation is the most ultimately insulting form of that. That's not just worshiping an idol. That's putting an idol in the most holy spot on the planet Earth, which means it's in Jerusalem, it's in the temple. More than that, it's in the holy place. No, it's even more than that. It's in the Holy of Holies. And that actually happened in 167 BC. That's why we know so much about it. That's why it has this peculiar designation. But I want you to notice this thing, whatever it is, some people try to make that term apply to other things. But here Jesus amplifies it for us. Stand in the holy place. It's an idol standing in a particular place in the Holy of Holies. And that's exactly what is mentioned in Daniel chapter 8 and 9 and 11 and 12. It all makes allusions to this famous historical event that did take place 2 centuries earlier than when Jesus used this expression. So that stand in the holy place. There are some people that notice that when Titus's legions were sieging Jerusalem, the temple caught fire. And he's very upset about that, but they have to take it all apart because of the fire. But the Roman soldiers, when they finally had their victory, brought their ensigns, their tribal insignia, to the eastern gate. And it was a custom of the soldiers to worship their ensigns. That was their idols, if you will. They're not in the temple, they're at the eastern gate. And some people say, well, that was the abomination of desolation because the Roman soldiers were worshiping their idols there at the Temple Mount. That's not what it's saying. That doesn't conform to the, it's an attempt to try to shoehorn that into the text, but it's not correct. And then we have this very strange verse, a parenthetical remark in this verse, and Mark does the same thing. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Why is that there? That's there for you. That's there to point out to you that this issue is not just for pastors or theologians. Whoever reads this has a requirement to understand. Jesus is instructing you to take the trouble, to do the diligence, to understand what on earth is the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So we want to get into that. Well, Antiochus III was Antiochus the Great. In secular history, accomplished a number of things, but it's his son that we're going to focus on, Antiochus IV. His brother had been murdered by his minister as the king of Syria at the time, and so Antiochus IV becomes his successor. His brother gets murdered, and I assume that the records are accurate that it was his minister, Heliodorus, that killed him, but I wouldn't be surprised if Antiochus had a part of it because he's obviously benefited by it. He's recorded in history. There's a lot of information about him as a despot. He's very eccentric and unreliable, very unpredictable, and very cruel and very tyrannical, as exemplified by his treatment, among other things, of the Jews. He adopted an epithet called Epiphanes. That's an abbreviation of the Greek, Theos Epiphanes, which is a designation that he gave him for himself, the God who appears or reveals himself. So Epiphanes is an abbreviation of the Greek, Theos Epiphanes, a designation he gave himself, which means, in effect, the God who appears or reveals himself. He put it on his coins and that sort of thing. Now, he decided to undertake the total eradication of the Jewish religion. There already was a movement within the culture towards Hellenizing their culture. A lot of the Jews were separating themselves from the traditions of the Old Testament, but he took over to try to just enforce that movement, to eradicate the Jewish religion, and to establish Greek polytheism in its place. And so the observance of all the Jewish laws, think about that, understand how pervasive their laws were within their culture, especially those relating to the Sabbath and to circumcision. They were forbidden under penalty of death. You got caught observing the Sabbath day, you were executed. If you circumcised your children and they found out about it, that was a capital crime. That's pretty severe stuff. You know, it's interesting how you go through history, how the Sabbath becomes an issue all through history. Even the early church maneuvered its way to separate themselves from the Sabbath. It was an anti-Semitic trend in the church at the time. So all Jewish practices were set aside in all the cities of Judea, not just Jerusalem. And the sacrifices that they had, they not only didn't let them do the Jewish sacrifices, they forced them, under penalty of death, to sacrifice to pagan deities in every village. They had representatives of the crown everywhere to enforce this. Once a month they searched, and anyone that had hidden away a copy of the Torah or had circumcised his kids was condemned to death. Think about it. Yeah, this is severe stuff. This is comparable to what Hitler was trying to do, in some respects even more so, in Germany. So Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. In Jerusalem on the 15th of Kislev in December of 168 BC, he broke the league that he had made. I find this in Josephus. It's interesting. He apparently had made a covenant with them to protect them for a while, but he violated it. And in anticipation of his birthday, incidentally. He had built a pagan altar on top of the altar of burnt sacrifices in the temple. So he desecrated it by building a pagan altar on top of it. He stripped the temple of all its treasures. They went through and took everything that they could find. It's interesting the Ark of the Covenant's not mentioned. It was already disappeared elsewhere. But the golden altars and the table of showbread and all the vessels, he took all that stuff. And he pillaged not just the temple, the whole city of Jerusalem. 10,000 were taken captives, and he compelled them to forsake their worship, he forbid circumcision, and he crucified the violators. And now, by the way, notice that the crucifixion, by the way, it's interesting to notice this. It was invented by the Persians. It was widely adopted by the Romans, but that's later. Antiochus is crucifying. At that time, it was still novel to some extent. And, of course, the Torah was forbidden to start. All this is detailed for you in Josephus' writings called the Antiquities, Book 12. On the 25th of Kislev, which happens to be, apparently was Antiochus' birthday, the sacrifice was brought on the altar for the first time, and this is recorded in the first Maccabees. He also offered a swine, not only on that altar, but in every village. There's a lot of villages in Judea. And Josephus records all that. But then the real thing that, the straw on the camel's back kind of thing, is he erected an idol to Zeus in the Holy of Holies. It had already been stripped of everything in there, but he converted it into a pagan shrine by putting an idol to Zeus in the Holy of Holies. And then First Maccabees, that's recorded as the desolating sacrilege. In Second Maccabees, it's alluded to also that he is setting up the temple, the Holy Temple, as a temple to Jupiter Olympius. Well, what's the result of all of this? That was the final issue of going too far. Up till then, it was just very bloody, very, very oppressive. But there's a spontaneous revolt that starts. There is an aged priest by the name of Mattathias who lived in a village called Bedine with his 5 sons. And some officers arrived to carry out Antiochus' decrees at his village. And this aged priest had enough's enough, right? This is an old man. He ends up killing the first Jew that approached the pagan altar. See, in every village they had these pagan altars, and they were required to offer sacrifice. And then the royal official who presided over this, he murdered him too. So this aged priest and his 5 sons are suddenly fugitives in a moment of anger, Mattathias killed these two guys, but then they realize they're on the lam now. So they head for the hills. So this is just an incident? No. It's going to turn out to be a full-scale war. Mattathias and his 5 sons became the nucleus of a band of rebels against Antiochus in general. His 5 sons were John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan, but they each had nicknames. And the one best known, of course, was Judas Maccabeus. The word Maccabeus came from the Aramaic, Maccabah, which means the hammer. He was known as the hammer. That's his see, we always thought that's just naval aviation gives you those labels, but no, this goes way back. But anyway, this guy Judas turns out to be a very, very sharp leader. Mattathias dies shortly thereafter and leaves the leadership in the hands of Judas. And that becomes then a popular label for the family and his followers. They were actually Hasmoneans, but they're known as the Maccabean revolt and the Maccabean followers. And so Judas is apparently, instinctively, a brilliant leader. And what began as just sort of a guerrilla war turns into a full-scale military engagement against the Seleucid Empire. And so these smaller Jewish forces get stronger, more resolved, and they defeat the vastly more powerful Syrian armies. And some of his achievements included the recapture of Jerusalem. It took them 3 years, but they recaptured Jerusalem, and when they did so, there's a small part in Acre Fortress where the Syrians still hung out, but they rededicated the temple. And that's a very key event in Jewish history because they were on the 3rd anniversary of its desecration. They rededicated. They destroyed the pagan altars and all the places that the Greeks had defiled, and they rebuilt all the necessary implements for temple worship, and they reestablished temple worship. And the rededication of that temple is what they celebrate every year at what they call Hanukkah. Don't confuse Hanukkah with the colorful legends that surround every holiday tends to, collect legends as the years go by. And don't get hung up just on the legends that surround it. Recognize that the real issue is the rededication of the temple that was desecrated. And by the way, this is alluded to in John chapter 10, verse 22. Jesus makes reference to it. And so on the 25th of Kislev, 164 BC, that's 3 years after it was desecrated in 167 BC, it's celebrated. And John 10:22 makes reference to it, although you have to do a little digging to understand that. And it's also that year that Antiochus' death takes place. So he passes away, good riddance. And Judas continued to successfully press what now became not just that issue, but a war for independence. And his last great victory was over the forces of Nicanor at Beth Horon, the same place that Joshua had the long day and all of that, in March of 161, 3 years later. So this leads to a period in Jewish history called the time of the Hasmoneans. And many people can't connect the dots because the name of the family that really led this was the Hasmonean family. Mattathias was Hasmonean. But because it gets the label of Judas, the Maccabean, the hammer, there's some confusion among casual reading. So when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, Jesus says, that's an event that occurred 2 centuries earlier that is well known to every Jew. Every Jew that celebrates Hanukkah knows at least part of the story. And, of course, Daniel hammers this. And it's an item, there's lots of desecration, there's lots of bad things, outlawing the Torah, circumcision. The issue was this idol in the holy place. That's the trigger. Now, by the way, there's a technology statement hidden here. Because stand in the holy place, that's in the Holy of Holies. The only people that can go in the Holy of Holies is the high priest, and only he can go in once a year after great ceremonial preparation on Yom Kippur. The Holy of Holies is sealed off with a veil, which obviously had been replaced by then and so forth. But Jesus says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation. He's talking about people in Judea. How can people in Judea watch what's going on in this political event called the desecration of the Holy of Holies? The answer is on CNN. In other words, the event that Jesus is pointing to will be an event that everyone in Judea, maybe the whole world, can watch happen. Because of what's taken for granted here, in effect, is that we will have live video news coverage. When ye therefore shall see. And he's going to, as you'll see in the subsequent verses, he's talking to people who are in Judea. How can, if they're in Judea, watch what's going on in the Holy of Holies? It's a political event. It's the same way we've been watching the conclave issues from the new pope. We're not in Rome, but you can watch the crowds and you watch the first Mass that he did and all that as if you were there, see? Okay, and who shall we let him understand? Here's the admonition by the Lord for you to study this so you really understand it. But then when you see that, what does he say to do? Let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Not in Paris, Rome, or London, or Los Angeles. No, them which be in Judea. It's a local issue. Let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. And when he says split, he means now. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. They need to understand how the architecture is in that part of the country. Most houses are on a hillside, and the roof is sort of like a garden. You may not have a lot of land, but you've got the roof. So that's where you entertained. That's where you had the weekend barbecue. It was on the roof. So typically, if you're entertaining or you're home casually, you're on the housetop. That was designed for that. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. You split now. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. He's out there in work clothes. If he somehow gets wind of what's going on here, he heads out now. Woe unto them that are with child and them that give suck in those days. And pray that your flight be not in the winter. Why? Because often Judea is not passable in the winter. It snows. But then you have this revealing little remark, neither on the Sabbath day. That tells you something. To whom is Jesus talking? To people who are in Judea. Right. What kind of people are they? Jews. The Jewish. Matthew wrote to the Jews. Matthew is a Levi. The whole gospel is very, very Jewish. His whole occupation is presenting Jesus Christ as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, etc. So you need to understand the Jewishness of Matthew in the first place, and this is very consistent with that. Pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. If you're a Christian, you don't care. If you're a Jew, you care. You've got constraints. The Sabbath day. Very key point. We'll come back to that later. And then why are you getting out of there with such urgency? He explains in verse 21, for then shall be great tribulation. There's that term from which we get the label for that period of time, the great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time nor ever shall be. That's a wild statement. How much evil, how much oppression has there been in the world? A bunch. If you just looked at what Antiochus Epiphanes was doing, that's bad enough. You look at the Nazi Holocaust, etc., etc. Jesus is saying there is a time coming that will be the worst it's ever been to that time or ever would be again. The Holocaust in Europe they estimate took 1 Jew out of 3 out of Europe. 1 in 3. Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 and 9 indicates that the next one is going to take 2 out of 3. I didn't say that. Zechariah did. Chapter 13, verse 8 and 9. In fact, Jesus goes on to point out here in verse 22, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. By the way, that's another one of these technology statements. If you and I were studying this, say, during the 1860s, during the Civil War period, we'd have a hard time visualizing this. We can't visualize the world wiping itself out with muskets and bayonets. But that cloud overhangs every geopolitical decision on the planet Earth today. There's enough in inventory many times over to wipe out the entire planet. Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Jesus is in effect quoting from Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12 opens up, "At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people." There you have his job description. We know what Gabriel is. Gabriel is an annunciator. He's always announcing something having to do with the Messiah, whether it's to Mary or to Daniel or wherever. Michael is a military commander. He's the great prince that standeth for the children of Israel. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book, and so forth. Same concept there is. We have an echo in the Olivet Discourse. This same period of time is commented on by Jeremiah. He gives it another label. He says, "Alas, for the day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." The Great Tribulation is the label that we use from the New Testament because of Jesus' remark. The Old Testament equivalent phrase is the time of Jacob's trouble. It's worldwide, but the focus is Israel or Jacob. The time of Jacob's trouble. Then Jesus continues, "Then if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here he is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect." Boy, we're not ready for that. We're not ready to see political leaders raise people from the dead or whatever. We're not used to seeing miracles. We always assume if it's a miracle, it must be of God. Not necessarily so. There are things called lying wonders, and it's going to be very prevalent among the leadership that's coming. And Jesus said, "Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even to the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." That's a phrase that scholars still scratch their head. What could that mean? The word carcass is the same word as would be used for a body. The eagles are not carrions. Eagles are not like vultures. Some people try to say, well, gee, that term may be covering both. They wrestle with this. It may mean as simply this, that where Christ is, that's where we will be with him. But there's not good scholastic agreement on how to apply that verse. So I'll leave that to you for your own thought. But immediately after the tribulation of those days again, notice each step in Matthew's account, it's then and then and then. Everything is later, 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 later. So you hear after the abomination of desolation, then we have the tribulation. Then after the tribulation, immediately after the tribulation of those days, shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heavens shall be shaken. There are people that try to say all this has happened back in 70 A.D. What do they do with verse 29 and 30? They got a couple of problems. First of all, I don't know that the sun was darkened, the moon didn't give her light, and the stars fell from heaven, the powers of heavens being shaken. And not so you'd notice. But then the next verse is even tougher. "And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, for they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." That's one problem the preterists have if they're going to try to say this is all fulfilled back a long time ago. Because they have to allegorize all of this. They have to somehow shine it on. And it's not easy. Immediately after the tribulation. Now, those of you that studied Daniel know about the 70th week, the 70 weeks of Daniel that Gabriel gave Daniel, how 69 were fulfilled to the very day, fulfilled when Jesus presents himself as the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the King, and how the last of the 70 weeks is still to tick off. We are in that interval. In that interval, Gabriel tells Daniel the Messiah will be executed. That's mentioned in the Old Testament. It's predicted that he would be executed, and that the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. And indeed they were. That interval is at least 38 years. We've experienced that it's virtually 2,000. But what we're looking for, what's coming, is a last week of years to fulfill the 70-week prophecy of Daniel. All this is out of Daniel 9. And that last week of years is a literal week of actually 6 years and 11 months. And it's defined by a covenant being enforced. It's not defined by the rapture or any of these other things. It's defined by a covenant being enforced by a world leader upon Israel. In the middle of that week, he establishes the abomination of desolation once again, just as was done by Antiochus Epiphanes. It's interesting that the records seem to indicate that Antiochus Epiphanes, when he entered Jerusalem, did it under subterfuge, under false pretenses. He violated his apparent agreement and took it over, and even took the people that were welcoming him and had them dealt with. But the abomination of desolation defines the middle of that week, and it's the period from the middle of that week to the end that is defined by none other than the Lord Jesus Christ himself as what we call the Great Tribulation. And it's a 3.5-year period, not 7, but most people speak of the 7 years collectively as the tribulation period. That's in a casual sense. And it is concluded by the Battle of Armageddon and all of that, and the second coming of Christ and the establishment of the millennium on the planet Earth, if you take the text seriously. Now, there are different views about the tribulation. The post-tribulationists figure that somehow at the end here is when the believers are caught up, which is a little awkward because when he comes back at his second coming, he comes back with the saints. And between them being gathered and coming back, there's the marriage supper of the Lamb. And as one person quipped, he says, post-tribulational view makes the marriage supper of the Lamb a snack lunch. Because you go up and you come right back down. And he's, of course, being just kidding a little bit. But there are those, and we tend to align with those that are pre-tribulationists. That is, we believe that the gathering of those that are in Christ will be prior to this whole period. And we won't burden this briefing trying to justify that position. There's lots of reasons we hold that view. There are those that correctly point out that the wrath that are pre-wrath, that is, that the church is gathered before the wrath of God, but the wrath of God is that last 3.5 weeks. So some people call them mid-tribulationists. Both the mid and post-tribulational viewpoints suffer from a problem called they violate the doctrine of imminence. If post-trib and mid-trib were correct, then Jesus can't come back today, because there's a whole bunch of events that have to occur prior to that time. And if you're going to assume that the doctrine of imminence is correct, then that means there's nothing that need intervene, that Jesus could come back for us all this afternoon, tomorrow morning, whenever. That's what they call the doctrine of imminence, and both mid and post-tribulation views have a problem with that. That's not the only reason. That's one of the reasons we cling to a pre-trib position. I'll point out something else. When people make charts, they often forget this. There's an indeterminate period of time between the gathering of the saints and the beginning of that 70th week. Why? Because the 70th week is defined by a world leader enforcing a covenant with Israel. In order to enforce that covenant, he has to be in power. In order to be in power, he must have been revealed publicly, and before he can be revealed publicly, the rapture takes place. So there's an interval. It might be an hour, it might be a day, it might be several years. We don't know. But the rapture does not trigger the 70th week. It's some indeterminate time prior, apparently, if we understand it correctly. Then Matthew continues, then shall he send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. Well, I thought they were raptured. No, there's a whole bunch of people, hopefully. In fact, there's going to be incredible fruitfulness of the 144,000, two witnesses. There's all kinds of things that occur after the rapture that cause people to get saved. And that's what's being gathered here. Now learn, and some people call them the tribulation saints. There's people that have come to faith during the tribulation. But then we have this interesting enigmatic parable. Now learn the parable of a fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass until all these things be fulfilled. There have been acres of books published trying to speculate from these factors what it means time-wise. There are many people that try to make the fig tree an idiom of Israel. And that there are occasions when that might be justified, but there's also, you'll discover that's not consistent. And you'll also discover that Israel is generally figured as the vine in Isaiah 5 and elsewhere. And so people who try to make that have a tough time selling it. And then the question is, how long is a generation? It's pretty easy to justify 38 years as a generation, because that was what a generation was defined as in Deuteronomy. with the wandering in the wilderness, we say is 40 years. That's round numbers. It was precisely 38 years. And it was also 38 years between these discourses and the temple being torn down. So, but what triggers this? And we'll come back to that in a little bit. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. A familiar passage, but what's even more remarkable is the way Mark records it. Mark goes one step further. The equivalent place in Mark, he says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, neither the Son, but the Father only. Do you mean to say, at least at that time, there was something that the Father knew that the Son did not? That sort of shatters our understanding, because at the upper room we got the impression that I and the Father are one. And so I'm not here to unravel that, just to highlight the fact that at least at this moment there was something that the Father had in his own counsel. And I think there's some reasons he did that was very, very closely held. We'll come back to that. Then Matthew goes on, but as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Most scholars assume that all this is trying to get across is that it was business as usual until the coming of the Son of Man occurs. And that's justifiable. There are many scholars, however, that suspect there's more into this than just that. It's more than that. To really understand this idiom, you need to understand what was the cause of the days of Noah. And we're not going to get into that here except to highlight, to really understand this, you need to get into Genesis 6 and understand why God sent the flood in the first place. And that gets into the whole issue of the Benai Elohim and the Nephilim and all of that. And so there may be far more lurking behind this passage than most people sense on first reading. But then Matthew goes on, but then shall be two in the field, one shall be taken, the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, one shall be taken, and the other left. Watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. In the Mark account, he mentions that two men will be sleeping in the same bed, one will be taken, the other left. What's interesting about the passage is that it's also a technology statement, because you've got people the women grinding at the mill did the first thing in the morning. They ground the meal for the day. Two men in the field was during the day. Two men sleeping would be at night. So you got morning, noon, and night at the same instant. It's a testimony to around earth, if you will. And people have different views in this, but I suspect that he's gathering his people. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. That's in the King James English, but it's misleading because the good man sounds like a good guy. Not necessarily. The word really means the master or just the head of the house. Know that if the head of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, who's coming like a thief in the night? Jesus is. So who's the good man of the house? Who is the God of this world? See, the good man he's suffering his house to be broken up. See, I believe the idiom here is Satan himself. Know that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. I think the idea here is that the thief that's coming in the night is our Lord. And it's his way of saying that for such time as you think not, He's going to catch you. Be careful he doesn't catch you by surprise. But in this case, see, it's the house that's being broken up. But then he goes on. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Verily I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant shall say in his heart, the Lord delayeth his coming, he shall begin to smite his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunken. The Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder and appoint his portion with the hypocrites, and there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's the Matthew account. In our next session, we'll examine Luke and show some surprises between the two that will raise more questions than we even started with. But it'll be rewarding. Stay with us. Well, in this second session, we'll now examine the Olivet Discourse as recorded by Luke. We read it superficially through once last time, in the last session. Let's take a look at it a little more closely. As some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, as for these things which ye behold, the days will come in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another, shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign shall there be when these things shall come to pass? So far, so good. Very parallel to the Matthew account, it would seem. And he said, take heed that ye be not deceived. There again, we have that admonition that's epistemological, and how do you keep from being deceived? For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them. But when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. So far, we're quite comfortable. It seems to track the Matthew account very closely. And then he gets to this group of signs. Then said he unto them, nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. So far, so good. But then we get, and this is, of course, the signs we talked about earlier that Matthew called the beginning of sorrows, the beginning of birth pangs. Wars, famines, pestilences, and so forth. They are not only detailed in Matthew and Luke, but they also seem to parallel the same events in the book of Revelation chapter 6. But notice after verse 11, there's a very important phrase that we don't want to miss. Luke says something very strange here. After highlighting all these signs, he then says, but before all these, whoops. See, that's just the opposite of what Matthew said. All his remarks were after those signs. Luke says, but before all these, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, and being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. And it shall turn to you for a testimony. So he's speaking here to the new believers in that first century. These are people that before anything else, they're going to be taken and persecuted, brought into synagogues and prisons. Remember, the early persecution of the church was by the Jews. The Roman persecution followed later. And Jesus gives these early believers some advice. Settle it therefore in your hearts not to meditate before what you shall answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which your adversary shall not be able to gainsay nor resist. And ye shall be betrayed both by parents and brethren and kinsfolk and friends, and some of you shall they cause to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. Boy, doesn't that describe the early church? Doesn't that describe especially the letter to the church at Smyrna and so forth? But there shall not a hair of your head perish. In your patience possess ye your souls. When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Okay, that's so far so good. Then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Let them which are in the midst of it depart out. Let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. It's understandable why people would think that, gee, this is the same thing as Matthew, except it's not. Matthew's discussion about getting out was after the abomination of desolation. This is before that group of signs. It's a different desolation altogether. And not only are they get out of town, if you're not in town, for heaven's sakes, don't come in. That's what he's saying. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. So we're dealing here with the siege of Jerusalem, and we need to understand a little bit more what happened there. Vespasian and his son obviously were very prominent in the Roman chain of command. Vespasian was commanded by Nero to attack Jerusalem. In fact, Judea in general, Jerusalem in particular. And so he and his son, Titus, attacked the cities in the Galilee and there's a whole campaign that's detailed for you by Josephus. He recorded it in great detail, how they're knocking off one city after another. They're not at Jerusalem yet, but they're making their way down to Judea. Then a strange thing happens that we overlook. Nero dies. And the maneuvering for the throne goes on. First Galba takes over, then Otho, and then Vitellius, all for just a matter of months. Total turbulence in Rome. And what does Vespasian do? He goes to Rome and he ends up taking over the entire empire, leaving his son Titus to fulfill what they had started. So there is a hiatus there of more than a year that they're in place almost, but they haven't set up the siege yet. Titus is left to complete the siege, and you can find all this in Josephus in the Wars of the Jews, book 6, chapter 6, verse 1 and following. So Titus actually sets up the siege. Now, here's the real point. Eusebius records in book 3, chapter 5, verse 1, that because of that hiatus in the siege, where it wasn't sealed off yet, the Christians that took Jesus' advice got out. And according to Eusebius, they went to a town called Pella in the mountains in Perea. That's over way east of the Jordan. And so it's interesting. I always wondered where scholars get this fact that there's about 1,100,000 that were slaughtered in the siege of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem fell. And yet I had several scholars, I came across this understanding by some that there are no Christians that perished in that siege. Where did they get that? Well, I found out it's because the records, Eusebius being one of them, and there's some others that indicate that they split because the siege wasn't sealed off yet. But it was clear that it was coming to anyone that was sensitive. And Jesus told them, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of town. And they did. And they succeeded because of that. And you'll find that mentioned in a number of places in the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers. Volume 1 has most of Eusebius' writings, and I checked it out. But anyway, the advice continues for this first desolation. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. Now, wait a minute. That's not what's going on in the Great Tribulation. They're just getting crunched. No, they're led away captive to all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, here we have a huge issue. First of all, it's clear, as you've been up till now, then, that what Luke is focusing on is a desolation of Jerusalem that's before the beginning of sorrows and all those signs. What we have in front of us are two desolations of Jerusalem. One before all those signs, that's what Luke is talking about. That did happen in 70 AD. And a final great tribulation that occurs later. There's two different desolations in view here. And but Luke also says, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles till the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. This has got a lot of people very excited. There was a lot of excitement when the state of Israel was reborn. Just in the Old Testament, can a nation be born in a day? It was. In May 14th of 1948. And there are many people that try to set dates. Gee, one generation from that, call it 40 years, that would be 1988. And we had all those books, and a guy by the name of Wisenant, was convinced that Christ was coming back because of that understanding here. Well, when that didn't happen, so gee, maybe the real duration here is not the nation Israel, it is the city of Jerusalem. And in June of 1967, as a result of the Six-Day War, Jerusalem's now, for the first time in 2,000 years, under the Star of David. That's kind of exciting. So a lot of people are starting to count from there. Well, you say, gee, if a generation is 38 years, and if you say Jerusalem isn't trodden down by the Gentiles since June of 1967, you add 38 to 67, you get an interesting year. This one. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that's correct. I'm just saying that's where some people are getting excited. Because one can validly argue Jerusalem is still trodden down by the Gentiles. we do not have, Israel is unable to get the nations to put their embassies there. They call it their capital. It's under dispute. It's still contested. And that's why we watch that with great interest. But there's another issue that lurks behind this that's still indeterminate. What is the trigger for that generation? I'll come back to that before we finish. Anyway, Luke continues, there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and the stars, upon the earth, distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. So Luke is looking ahead here. He's talked about the one signs. He's looking ahead at this cosmic upheaval. There's something interesting. It's not actually here. There's nothing about the tribulation. This is stuff that happens after the tribulation. It's as if he's overlooking that, if you will. But this verse 26, when I was on the board with Walter Martin, his ministry, he used to love to quote this verse, men's hearts failing them for fear, and he'd always gesture like this, and for looking after those things which are coming upon the earth. And he would gesture with like a flying saucer. So he was convinced that was a UFO that we talk about. Men's hearts failing themselves for fear, for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And so he was into that at that time. Yeah. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So that's very similar to the cosmic upheavals that Matthew talks about. And then Luke goes on to say, when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Boy, now that's interesting. What does that mean? Well, this word redemption is an interesting word because it occurs, it's apolutrosis. It is a word that occurs 9 times in the New Testament. It means a releasing affected by the payment of a ransom. It is used 9 times, always of the body of Christ. And so that's kind of an exciting thing because Luke is focusing on the first desolation and then he focuses on our redemption. He doesn't mention the tribulation at all, strangely enough. But then he also goes on in a parallel fashion to Matthew. He spake to them a parable, behold the fig tree and all the trees. Whoops, wait a minute. Notice that? I think any attempts to try to identify the fig tree with Israel and so forth is misplaced because I think Luke tips the apple cart over here. The idiom is simply a parable about spring foreshadowing summer. He spake to them a parable saying, behold the fig tree and all the trees. When they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. It's that simple. Attempts to try to make the fig tree Israel or the city of Jerusalem or whatever, I think is ineffectual. In fact, if you're really strict on that, there's issues of what's the fig tree, what's the vine, and the olive tree. Those are all different things, and they're used idiomatically from the parable that's in the book of Judges. But let's not go down that path today, because this is clearly nullifies it, in my mind at least. Jesus says, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Is that the same generation that Matthew was talking about? Not sure. Let's get back. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and the cares of this life, so that that day come upon you unawares. For as a snare shall it come upon all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Now that's a phrase we want to be alert to. In the book of Revelation, in that book very clearly, there is a distinction between those that are saved and those that dwell on the earth. The earth dwellers in the book of Revelation are the losers. They're the ones that get wiped out. They're the ones that lose. It's interesting that in the book of Revelation, the only celebration as characterized by exchange of gifts and so forth, is when the 2 witnesses finally die. And the earth dwellers cheer that these 2 troublemakers are finally off their back. And for 3 days they lay in the streets until on CNN or whatever they get resurrected. That should catch everyone's attention. But as you read the book of Revelation, you want to be sensitive to the fact that there are the Lord's own and the earth dwellers. You and I are not earth dwellers. We may be here, but we're pilgrims. We look for a city whose maker is God. And so the earth dwellers, and I suspect that's exactly what's saying here, for as a snare it shall come up all them that dwell upon the face of the earth. If you're earth dwellers, you want to have a very light touch as we pass through here. And then verse 36, watch ye therefore, and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. Well, wait a minute. How can they escape these things? And if they do escape, they're going to stand before the Son of Man? What is he talking about here? One of the things that we'll discover, incidentally, as we go here, in the next few verses, is that this didn't even occur on the Mount of Olives. Let's go on here a little bit. We had the beginning of sorrows, the false Christ, wars, famines, pestilence, and earthquakes. And these were collectively labeled by Matthew the beginning of sorrows, but the end is not yet, he says. Both accounts, both Matthew and Luke, allude to this cosmic upheaval group, with the sun, the moon, the stars, and so forth. And Matthew has it in verses 10 to 13. Luke has it in verse 25 and following. And Revelation, of course, deals with that downstream a bit. And remember when we were talking about these things back in verse 11, great earthquakes shall be in divers places, famines, pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall be from heaven. Then we have this strange passage by Luke. But before all these, everything Luke's talked about is before these beginning of sorrows. There's a different emphasis, at least, between where Luke says, but before all these, and Matthew says just the opposite. All these are the beginning of sorrows, then shall they. What the dividing, the watershed issue are the false Christ, wars, famines, and earthquakes. Luke clearly focuses his attention on that which occurs before those signs. Matthew clearly focuses virtually all his remarks on that occur after those. So they certainly have a different emphasis. One says before these things, and the other one says then shall they, or is another way of saying after these things. Same equivalent thought. So let's take a look. Let's talk about that resolving power we talked about earlier. Remember I said if you get a cheap telescope, they all look like they're one, the same thing. And yet if you get a good telescope, spend some more money, you get better optics, you discover that what you thought was a single thing is actually a pair that overlap. And so we have Luke and Matthew. And we have this strange group of signs called the beginning of sorrows that are common to both passages, except Luke talks about things that are before these things, and Matthew speaks of things after. They both talk about a desolation. I'll call Luke's desolation of Jerusalem number 1. That occurred in 70 A.D. Clearly, that's what he's talking about. And that's what the preterists jump on and say, well, the whole thing is all fulfilled. No, not so. Because Matthew talks about a different desolation of Jerusalem, one yet to happen. And Luke says of his generation that he's talking to, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. And it's interesting that 38 years from that to the fall of Jerusalem is exactly the duration of time that the generation passed away in the wilderness in the scripture. And Matthew seems to be talking about the last generation. The trick is and I'm not suggesting the last generation is 38 years. Why? Because he says unless those days be shortened, there should no one would be saved. No flesh would be saved. So there's a different emphasis. Let's try to look at this a little more precisely. Let's just lay out Matthew 24 in front of us and Luke 21. Okay? Now both of them talk about wars, famines, earthquakes, and so forth, the beginning of sorrows collection of signs. They also both allude to a subsequent cosmic upheaval. They both, climax with that. Okay. But see, Matthew, when he talks about the wars, famines, earthquakes, and so forth, says then, in other words, after these things, comes the abomination of desolation, which ushers in turn, the great tribulation that Jeremiah calls the time of Jacob's trouble. So far, so good. Luke, talking in his account, he mentions the same wars, famines, earthquakes, and so forth, but says before these things they shall take you and so forth. And he talks about the fall of Jerusalem that clearly happened in 70 AD with great precision. Now recognize that Matthew is talking to the Jews. I suspect the Holy Spirit knew that the Jews wouldn't be reading him anyway until after those signs. They'll start taking him seriously after the abomination of desolation and following. Matthew's account will turn out to be like a handbook of survival for that generation yet to come. Luke is speaking to Gentiles, Gentile believers, and he highlights that, hey, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, you get out of town. But when you begin to see these things, look up, your redemption draweth nigh. It's interesting that Luke speaks of what I'll call desolation number 1, Matthew desolation number 2. There's two separate ones clearly delineated by the cluster of signs in between them. Luke's talking about that first generation. Matthew, I think, is talking about the last generation. They're addressing two different audiences. Now, this becomes very relevant when you start studying the 7 letters to 7 churches, because they obviously occur after the fall of Jerusalem, because that happened in 70 AD, and those letters were written in about 95 AD, 20 years later. And yet still well in advance of the wars, famines, and earthquakes and so forth that will precede the abomination of desolation. In fact, as we look at those 7 letters, we discover some interesting things. The 7 letters have personal and application to us personally. It has application to all churches, but they also, among other things, profile a history of the church. That's sounds like a pretty wild conjecture, except it's borne out by the fact that if they were in any other order, what I'm going to show you, wouldn't be true. Ephesus is clearly the apostolic church, if we understand that letter, study it carefully. Smyrna is the one that is synonymous with myrrh, or death and persecution, and the whole letter is one of encouragement to Smyrna. Pergamos is the married church, where the church gets married to the world. What Satan couldn't accomplish through persecution, he accomplished by having the church join the world. That leads to the medieval church with all its abuses. And that, of course, leads to the Reformation, which leads to what I'll call, for lack of a better term, the denominational church. You say you're alive, but you're really dead. You're in name only. And out of that comes, of course, the Philadelphia church, the missionary church. And the final is the apostate church, the one that thinks they're rich, but are destitute. 2 of these letters have nothing bad said about them. Smyrna, because it's persecuted, Jesus says, everyone has a report card, some good, some bad. But Smyrna has nothing bad. Just hang in there, guys. You're doing great. And Philadelphia has nothing. They're doing great, too. There are 2 that have nothing good said about them. The Laodicean church has nothing good said about them. And strangely enough, the Sardis church does nothing good said about them. That's very disturbing to the Protestant denominational church. But we notice that the first 3 letters are characterized by having the promises of the overcomer subscripted, and the last 4 have the promises in the body of the letter. So it's a distinctive for some reason. We also discover that the last 4 have explicit references to the second coming of Christ. The first 3 don't. So the possibility, and we also know that Thyatira is promised that they're going to go into the tribulation unless they repent. So we know there's one church that's vulnerable to that, if not more. We know Philadelphia's promised to be raptured, in effect, if we study it carefully. And that leaves some question marks about some of the others. But all of this, in any case, is prior to the wars, famines, earthquakes, and so forth. Are we together? That's a perspective. It's not necessarily correct. It's just one that we hold, and we challenge you to study it carefully and come to your own conclusions. But the interesting thing about this, in any case, is Luke doesn't even mention the Great Tribulation. Why? I believe it's because his listeners aren't going to be in it. I think that's kind of interesting. I think that's worth paying close attention to. But there's a couple of verses I forgot to read with Luke. As you finish it, it says, in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, and at night he went out and abode in the mount which is called the Mount of Olives. That's interesting, because Matthew and Mark's account were on the Mount of Olives privately. Luke apparently is accounting that which Jesus told his following in the temple. He says, and all the people came early in the morning to him in the temple for to hear him. I think that's rather provocative. It may very well be that what Luke is summarizing is a teaching that Jesus gave under that condition, more than once probably as the days went by, but it's a summary of what he taught, in contrast to the private inside briefing that Jesus gave his disciples. They're addressing different audiences. Matthew writes to the Jew. Indeed he does. He's occupied from cover to cover with Jesus as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He starts out with the genealogy, the royal genealogy. He starts as any Jew would with Abraham, goes through Abraham to David, and from David down through the first surviving son of Bathsheba to Solomon, who was the, and then and following, all the way down to Joseph, the legal father of Jesus Christ. Luke is just the opposite. He's interested in Jesus as the Son of Man. He's a Gentile. He starts his genealogy in chapter 3. In effect, he starts with Adam, takes Adam to Abraham. From Abraham to David, they're identical. But when you get to David, Luke does a very strange thing. He takes a left turn. He doesn't go through the first surviving son of Bathsheba. He goes through the second surviving son of Bathsheba, down through Heli, the father of Mary. And you have to understand, in addition to the fact that Mary is in the bloodline of Jesus, on top of that, you need to understand very carefully the daughters of Zelophehad in the Torah. Zelophehad had 5 daughters. He goes to Moses to talk about inheritance. He says, I don't have any sons. Moses goes to the Lord. The Lord says, make an exception. He does. So we have this strange issue of the daughters of Zelophehad. When you get to Joshua, these 5 daughters come to Joshua and say, now that you're in the land, we're entitled to inherit. Check it out. Joshua does. They're right, and they inherit. Now the point of it is that the Torah provides that if a father has no sons, and she marries within the tribe, that her husband inherits what would have been hers. The way that worked is the father of the bride adopted the husband as a son. That happens in Ezra and Nehemiah and several places, and that's exactly what Heli did with Joseph. So Joseph was a son-in-law of Heli. And that's exactly what, by the way, Luke 3 says, that he's a son as reckoned by law, is what nomitzo means in the Greek. So anyway, what I'm getting at is Matthew has a Jewish perspective, Luke has a Gentile perspective. Matthew's account, as is Mark, or Peter's account, is this private briefing on the Mount of Olives, as so delineated in both Matthew 24 and Mark 13. Luke, on the other hand, is writing to the Gentiles. He's very non-Jewish, in effect, in his perspective. And he apparently taught in the temple. So he's talking to a larger group, a less select group, if I may, and yet at the same time believers. Believers that apparently survived that first desolation by following Jesus, his instructions. So in conclusion, in eschatology, we have this abomination of desolation. Stand in the holy place. The attempts by the preterists and others to say, well, that was fulfilled when the Romans fell Jerusalem. There was a war going on. There wasn't a time to ceremonialize anything. In fact, the temple caught fire. It's unclear how the fire started, but it was clear that Titus was really upset about it, because he was hoping to have it as a trophy. But they can't control this fire. When it's all over, he has to instruct his troops to take the temple apart stone by stone to recover all the melted gold, because the interior was wood panels overlaid with gold. So all that gold melted, and it was sufficient justification to take it apart, which they did. But there's another issue. The preterists like to argue that, well, there's a record that the Romans assembled all their ensigns of the 5th, 10th, 12th, and 15th Roman legions at the eastern gate to celebrate the victory. Things burning over there, but they're celebrating. Their ensigns for their various legions also operated as their idols. They did a worship to their ensigns. But see, the point is, if the preterists try to make that, they say, well, that's the abomination of desolation. That's pointless, because Jesus is pointing to that as something to watch for to get out of town before it gets rough. They're doing this at the end. There's no way that the Romans' worship of their ensigns is somehow the abomination of desolation. First of all, it's too late. It's over. That's a victory celebration, at the climax. So it just doesn't fit. It's what they call eisegesis. You're trying to force the text to say what you're hoping. There's an expression in the computer business that keeps coming to mind when I do these studies, that if you torture the data long enough, it'll confess to anything. And No, the abomination of desolation is a well-defined event in Jewish history because of the 167 issue. It's well documented. You can dig into it from a number of different places, and it's well known and still celebrated to this day through the rededication of that temple. So that's a milestone that Jesus highlights as the pivot point to understand prophecy. He points you in that passage of Matthew 24:15. He points you to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Once you understand that, it all comes together. So I encourage you to take a serious study of the 70 weeks of Daniel and understand who Antiochus Epiphanes was. Antiochus the Great was his father. He did a lot of things that got him a place in Greek history. But his son was the bad guy. And there's also an incident I want to make sure you've heard about with Caligula. And this is later. This is after the gospel period and so forth. But Caligula is on an ego trip, and he instructs his general in Judea. He's the emperor in Rome, but he instructs his general in Judea to place a statue of himself in the Holy of Holies. Petronius, being on the local scene, understands that if he tries to pull that off, he's going to have a repeat of what happened several centuries before. Because the Jews will become unglued. So he realized that that's not consistent with his mission to try to keep peace. The Romans' anxiety all the way through is to keep peace in the land. The thing they feared was insurrection. They almost didn't care what you do as long as you did it peaceably. And you may recall that the scribes and the Pharisees, when they planned to take Jesus Christ, did not plan to do it on a feast day for fear of the Romans. The reason it happened on Passover is because Jesus called the shots. At the upper room, he announces that Judas is going to betray him, and that put Judas in a box. He had a fisher cut bait. So he splits to make the arrangements. He had to do it then or not do it at all. The guy controlling the time was Jesus Christ. They had not planned to do it on a feast day, certainly not the feast of Passover, for crying out loud. Anyway, Caligula orders Petronius to put this, to reenact, in effect, the abomination of desolation scene from a few centuries earlier. Petronius refuses to do it. When Caligula finds out that he hasn't done it, he orders Petronius killed, understandably. But it happens within 2 weeks, Caligula dies of I've forgotten why now. Well, the message of Caligula's death gets to Judea before the message that was the edict to have Petronius killed. So he's off the hook. And when the emperor dies, all bets are off. There's a new regime stepping in. So it's kind of interesting, just an incident in history, but it's interesting how God seems to intervene to prevent the abomination of desolation reoccurring until the time is right. And that time implies that there's going to be a temple in Jerusalem. There isn't today. There needs to be a temple there to be desecrated. There needs to be a world leader that makes a 7-year agreement, covenant, or enforces a covenant. Maybe just you're going to enforce their right to the land, the Abrahamic covenant, whatever. But in the middle of that agreement to enforce that, he violates it and sets himself up to be worshipped. Because by then he's powerful enough to pull that off. He's on that ego trip, and we have a repeat of the whole Antiochus Epiphanes thing. If you want to know more about that, you can just study Daniel and study what Daniel says about Antiochus Epiphanes, because clearly the passages, especially in Daniel 11, that talk about Antiochus Epiphanes, and Daniel's talking about it as yet future, but as he predicts about Antiochus Epiphanes, he even sees more than that. And when you get to chapter 11, when you get down to about from 35, 36 to 40, it's clearly Antiochus Epiphanes. From 40 on, it's clearly yet future. There's a blurring there. Again, there's this resolution issue. And this hiatus of the siege in 70 AD is something that's overlooked by many historians, that because of Nero dying and the ambiguities of the throne, and Vespasian finally going to Rome to take over the empire, causes a halt, a hiatus, if you will, in the siege preparations of Jerusalem, which gave those that were informed a chance to get out of town, which they did, apparently, according to Eusebius and other records. Now, there's other implications of this, I think, that we should not overlook, and that's the deity of Christ. It's astonishing when you try to put it together to realize that Jesus predicted in Luke the details of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And the critics have a real jam here because they like to, late date things. But all the technology that's being applied to scripts and the scanning laser microscopes and so forth are moving the accepted dates of the New Testament documents earlier, not later. They believe they got copies of Matthew's, scraps of Matthew's document that may have been autographed that were like 50 AD, fairly early, much earlier than much of your handbooks would suggest. So here we have the deity of Christ exemplified by his laying out in advance the desolation of Jerusalem, enough so to get the Christians, out of there. I think that in itself is an interesting apologetic. So we have some issues. We talked about the destruction of Jerusalem. There's not one, there's two of them in view. And that's pretty clear, and that resolves most of the issues. Is it 70 AD? Yes. Is it yet future? Yes. Both are true. There's two different desolations. And the abomination desolation, what is it? I think we know very clearly if we just do our homework. When did it happen? In 167 BC. Is it going to happen yet? No. Jesus used that as an example of what's going to be repeated. We need to understand that. And of course, the whole idea of the Great Tribulation. It's very provocative to deal with the Great Tribulation. One of your homework assignments is to study and come to your own conclusion as to whether or not the church goes through the Great Tribulation. I'm using the church here in the mystical sense, not church X or church Y. I'm talking about the body of Christ. Will we go through the tribulation? I personally believe you can clearly prove that a church will not, but I'll leave that to your own studies. It's a whole study in its own right. The parable of the fig tree, I'd be very cautious in jumping to any conclusions with the fig tree because of Luke's remark, treating the fig tree like and all the other trees. It's simply an indication that if you see spring start, summer's coming. And which generation shall not pass away? Clearly, I think Luke's comment refers to the generation that did indeed embrace the fall of Jerusalem 70 AD. Now, Matthew's remark, I think, is referring to the final generation, but that's not very helpful in the sense that we don't know what that duration is. There's two things we don't know. We don't know the duration, although we could stipulate, for lack of a better term, it's probably 38 years also, except what is the triggering event? That's the whole big debate. Some people felt it was the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. There's absolutely no scriptural reason to point to that. Others say, well, it's the Jerusalem not being trodden down by the Gentiles. That's got two problems. It doesn't really say that exactly, but furthermore, it's still being trodden down by the Gentiles, in effect. The most interesting conjecture is the one that I tend to lean to. I think the triggering event is the rapture. I think once the rapture takes place, God's clock for Israel starts again. It's like a chess clock. When Jesus rode that donkey, he says, now these things are hidden from your sight. And in Romans 11:25, Paul tells you how long they're hidden, not forever. These things are hidden until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. Don't confuse that with the times of the Gentiles. The fullness of the Gentiles is, I believe, an idiom for the church. And I think the whole idea of the rapture is to catch Satan by surprise. To catch Satan by surprise. Because I think that's exactly the thrust of the passages we read. And that's why I think it's a closely guarded secret, so to speak. But I think there's a day when the Father says to the Son, go get him. When that number is complete. And that's when the church is completed. It was born in a miracle. It will be taken out in a miracle. And that's when Israel's clock will once again start ticking. And that also will explain the Jewishness of the book of Revelation from chapter 6 through 19. Up till then, there is no Jew or Gentile. There's Jew, Gentile in the church in Paul's idioms. And yet, in Revelation from chapter 4, verse 1 on, it gets very, very Jewish. And there's some reasons for that. We serve a Jewish king. And the doctrine of eminence overlays all this stuff. It's clear the scripture teaches, and Luke emphasizes actually, that he can come at any time. So all these things, the generation shall not pass away, and the fig tree and so forth, has no bearing for you and me. None. Why? Because he can come tomorrow. The doctrine of eminence says, for in such a time as you think not, the Son of Man cometh. And the real issue here, anyway, aren't these details. The issue, are you ready? That's the real issue. There is no priority in your life that is as great as dealing with, are you really ready for him? We don't want to be guilty. We don't want to be guilty like the church at Ephesus was. And they were really rigorous on doctrine. They tried those that say they're apostles or not and called them liars and so forth. They did a great job in terms of doctrine. And they hated the deeds of Nicolaitan and so forth. But they blew it because they lost their first love. Jesus wants devotion, not just doctrine. Are we really spending time with him? Are we really his? Are we really living our lives under the expectation that perhaps today he'll come? And this issue, doctrine of imminence, is the one that pervades every one of us individually, quite apart from the theologians or the preterists or this or that, whatever. Jesus, both Matthew and Luke say, therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. So if you're pretty sure he's not coming this afternoon, be careful. He might. And are we ready?